This episode is part 3 of my video series Scenery Experiments. In this video series, I'm going to attempt to weather my structures, add grass, foliage, and trees, and include figures and other small details. Welcome to Humanity Junction, where the city intersects with humans. In the last episode, I finished installing the trees and detailing the sidewalk. Starting off this episode, I'm going to be adding brown ground foam under the trees in front of the shops. I am using regular matte Mod Podge, applying it with a brush, and then sprinkling the ground foam around the trees. I started with the easier to reach trees in front of the shops and then moved on to the more difficult areas to reach. After letting the glue dry for a few minutes, I go back with a vacuum and remove all of the excess ground foam. Since I have a very large jar of ground foam and only need a very small amount, I did not save it. The next thing I did was to add matte Mod Podge to the top of the brown foam that I already applied between the station platform and the front edge of the module. I am doing this so that I can add some 2mm grass, which will add some variation to this area and make it not look so uniform. In this video clip, it is much easier to see the T-pin that I am using as my ground contact. Touching this wire to the glue in conjunction with holding the applicator close to the surface creates the static charge that is needed to get the grass to stand up on its end. To remove the excess grass, I put a stocking over the vacuum hose so that I could collect and save the grass. When doing a larger area, I will use a rubber band to hold the stocking in place, but for this area I just held the stocking with my hand. But do not let go or the vacuum will suck the stockings up. Do not ask me why I know this. I also added some more 2mm grass to the area inside my gravel pathway between the two shops. This time, I just turned over the module and gently banged it on my desktop, allowing the excess grass to fall to the desk. I then vacuumed off my desk, which needed it anyway. Being that I work in a small area, I try to keep it as clean and organized as possible. As a few of you pointed out in the comments on part 2 of this video series, they questioned whether the rolling stock would fit past the trees. The short answer is no. If only there was some tool that I could have utilized to identify the clearances I needed before adding the trees. Well, actually there is, and I have one, and it's about 8 inches away from where I was sitting. And I completely forgot about it. I used a standard boxcar to start trimming the trees back. I wanted the trees to be really close to the tracks, as if the trains passing by on a daily basis had caused the trees to grow around the path of the trains. I started on the main line, closest to the edge of the module. I just kept trimming and trimming until I was able to get the boxcar to roll past the trees without any interference. There was a lot that I needed to trim. Once the boxcar rolled freely, I tried the same test with a passenger car. While I do not have any intermodal trains, I do have a modified auto rack with some containers on top. Using this modified auto rack, I cut back the trees a bit further. I want to be able to run anything on this outer track. Once this was complete, I moved on to the trees that were planted next to the switch that feeds my siding. If I cut the trees back based on the distance to the siding, then I know I will not have any issues on the inside main line. Once again, this took a lot of trimming. But I also had an issue because the branches were also impacting the path of the test boxcar. To resolve this issue, I got out my small hot air gun that I had originally purchased to use on heat shrink. I used it to heat up the plastic branches until I could bend them far enough out of the way that I could get the boxcar through. I had to modify the trees a lot to get the boxcar to pass. I also tested with the passenger car before moving on to the other trees on the other side of the spur. My original idea for the spur is that due to a lack of use, the branches would be almost touching the trains as they went under the tree canopy. I wanted it to be a really tight fit. But as I started working on this area of trees, I realized that I would have to cut back a significant amount on the trees to make the train fit as if going through a tunnel. And then once I started thinking about a tunnel is when I remembered that I have an NMRA N-scale standards gauge. If you're not familiar with this gauge, it's basically a piece of metal with marks and cutouts to measure track width, wheel width, and other standards for N-scale as set by the NMRA, the National Model Railroad Association. The shape of the gauge is designed as a clearance gauge. Instead of using a boxcar, I could have used this gauge, set all of my clearances based on this, and then my module would have been NMRA compliant. As I held the gauge up around the layout, it was very apparent that I did not have the clearances needed to be NMRA compliant, and to modify these trees to be compliant, I would have had to almost completely cut them down. A few minutes after finding the gauge and considering my options, I eventually decided that I would leave the trees as they are now to maintain their fullness and just accept that I will not be able to run trains on the spur. My siding is set up as my programming track, and my command station does have drive on drive off of the programming track, so I could have used it for more minimal switching, but now it's definitely just going to be an abandoned siding and programming track. I want to share one tip that I received in the comment section on my first video. Instead of gluing in the trees, I could have used a small straw, like a cocktail straw, to maintain a hole and create a snug fit for the trees to just stick into. This would allow me to remove the trees to access the track, as well as would have enabled me to install different trees later on that would have fit better around the trains. Rolling on. The Walther's Butterfly Station platforms come with some benches that I had previously put together and painted them brown. I wanted to be able to use quick stick removable adhesive wax to attach all the benches and figures. I saw this used on another YouTube channel and wanted to give it a try so that the figures would be movable. I have several packages of Woodland Scenic's Scenic Accent sets of figures. I have a set of 5 seated passengers. I'm going to use these on the benches on the station platforms. A set of miscellaneous freight that I'm going to use outside the storefronts. Here is a set of depot workers and accessories. There is a person working a ticket counter as well as suitcases and freight for around the depot. I have a newsstand set. I'm going to use this along the side of the depot so that commuters can pick up their newspapers on their way to work in the morning. And being a dog person, I have some dogs and cats. I spread these out around the layout as fun figures to look for. These are a group of protesters that want better pay. I'm going to set these up inside the gravel walkway by the shops. I bought this set before the current events. And last but not least, I got a really cheap set of 50 figures. I'm planning to use some of these in the backgrounds of the scene where the detail is not as important, but where I still want to integrate some activity. While initially intending to use the wax, I found that the very small contact points of the N-scale items that I could not get enough wax on the items to get them to stick to the module. But luckily, Aleene's tacky glue worked pretty well. I started with the station platforms, installing all of the benches, passengers, and the depot set. The figures were so small that they were very hard to hold with the tweezers. Just being able to see them was hard enough. After finishing with the station area, I worked on setting up the protesters. Some of the figures kept falling over. Due to the tacky glue, it was a really slow fall. I had to keep adjusting them until the glue set. Here's one example of the protesters in the orange shirt slowly falling over backwards. It's actually a pretty graceful fall. Next, I moved on to setting up the newsstand next to the station depot. This is my second favorite kit, only losing out to the dogs and cat set because it includes a dog peeing on a fire hydrant. On the sidewalk between the shops and the apartment building, I wanted to add a few of the inexpensive figures. The figures kept slowly falling over and over again, and I had to keep standing them back up. I really liked the final effect of adding these figures to the walkway, but these were really difficult figures to get into place. The current state of this module is in a place that I would be very happy to bring it to a club meeting. And I also need to take a break from working on it. I have a lot of other modeling projects piling up that I want to work on, and this is a good point to pause working on my first T-Trak module build. Reviewing the photos that I took, I'm really happy with a lot of the details that I was able to include. And I learned a lot about DCC wiring between building my portable control box and the electronics on this module. I'm going to make one, maybe 2 more videos about this module build in the following weeks. In the next episode, I'm going to pull back the curtain and have an honest discussion about the scenery experiments on this module. In general, I am very happy with the results I was able to achieve as a beginner in model building. I learned a huge amount in the process, and I want to discuss a few of these educational moments in my next video. There are a lot of different ways to accomplish similar effects in modeling. I believe it'll be valuable to discuss what I did on this build, what I think I will do next time, and then also be able to read your comments on how you might tackle the same thing. I have learned a lot from the modeling community throughout this process, and I want to keep learning from each of you. Thank you for watching. Please leave any comments or questions below, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Please subscribe and select the bell icon to receive notifications. Thanks again, and have a great day.